If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to All of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. I'm standing in the driveway of my house on a Tuesday afternoon in September, and I can see the moving truck idling at the curb like some kind of mechanical predator. The engine rumbles, patient and heavy, and I'm holding a bouquet of wilted sunflowers in my hands because I just came from the cemetery where my daughter Emma has been sleeping for 3 months and 16 days. The flowers were supposed to be fresh. I bought them this morning at the farmer's market near Route 9, the one that used to be a Best Buy before they closed all those locations back in 2019, and the vendor there, a woman named Christine with kind eyes, had wrapped them in brown paper and told me they'd last at least a week if I changed the water every other day. But I forgot to put them in water. I forgot because I was too busy standing in my kitchen watching my father-in-law direct strangers to carry my daughter's dresser down the hallway and out the front door. That dresser has a scratch on the left side, about 3 inches long, that I put there myself when I was carrying Emma out of her room in the middle of the night, back when she had a fever that wouldn't break, and I thought maybe if I just held her close enough, moved fast enough, spoke prayers loud enough, I could outrun the diagnosis that was already chasing us. The scratch is still there. I can see it from where I'm standing. Franklin is standing on the porch, wearing khakis and a polo shirt like he's about to go golfing, and he's pointing at the dresser and nodding like he's approving a renovation on a property he's about to flip. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about a nursery. It was about taking my house. And this wasn't the first time he'd tested what he could take from me. I don't scream. I haven't screamed in 3 months and 16 days. Instead, I stand there in the driveway trying to understand how a man could erase his own daughter in under an hour, and I'm asking myself questions that I already know the answers to. Why did he feel entitled to my home? Why now? And what was he planning next? Because the nursery was only the beginning. Let me tell you who Franklin is, or at least who I thought he was before I understood what he was actually doing. I met him 5 years ago at my husband's company holiday party, held at a country club in Westchester that I'd never been to before and haven't been back to since. He was polite, helpful, always early, always watching. My husband Michael was everything Franklin wasn't, loud and warm and present in a way that made you feel like the world was a safer place just because he was in it. When Michael died in that car accident on Route 287, coming back from a sales meeting in New Jersey, Franklin became the man who helped me pick out a casket. He became the man who sat in my kitchen and told me which funeral home was best. He became the man who knew exactly when to show up with lasagna and exactly when to mention that my house had a lot of potential if I ever wanted to unlock the equity. He framed help as concern. He memorized the house. Every detail. He knew that the master bedroom had a window that didn't quite seal and let in wind during the winter. He knew that the foundation had a hairline crack on the east side, barely visible unless you were really looking for it. He knew that the roof was original to the house, built in 1987, and that homeowners with roofs that old always worried about insurance rates. He knew that Emma's room had the best light in the entire house, south-facing windows that caught the sun from 7 in the morning until almost 6 at night. He commented on wasted space. He'd stand in the doorway of her room and say things like, "You could really do something with this room," or "It's a shame to have such a good space just sitting here," or my personal favorite, "The baby will need somewhere to sleep when he comes." The baby was his new grandchild. His son, Michael's half-brother, whom I'd met exactly twice, had gotten a woman pregnant, and Franklin had decided that this baby represented the future, represented progress, represented everything that mattered. And Emma represented the past. A past that, in Franklin's mind, was holding me hostage. Looking back, every visit was an inspection. I just didn't know what he was building toward yet. The first time he mentioned changing the room, I laughed. I shouldn't have. It was a Sunday afternoon in June, just after Memorial Day, and I was sitting on the back porch reading a book, something forgettable about a woman who relocates to a small town to start over, and Franklin had let himself in through the side gate, which was technically unlocked but only technically, and he sat down next to me and said, "Sarah, I've been thinking about your future. He said it like he'd been given a directive from God. He said it like he was about to tell me something I didn't have the capacity to figure out on my own. I was 47 years old.
I own my home outright.
I had a job at a marketing firm in Stamford, Connecticut, where I managed social media campaigns for pharmaceutical companies, health solutions, beauty treatments, AI-powered wellness apps, the kinds of products that made promises and had disclaimers written in font sizes that required a magnifying glass to read. I had a therapist in New Canaan. I had friends. I had a life. But apparently, I didn't have the capacity to figure out my own future. Your house is too big for one person, he said. You're spending too much on utilities. Too much on maintenance. You're keeping Emma's room exactly like a shrine, and that's not healthy, Sarah. That's grief. That's you being stuck. He said the word stuck like it was a disease. He said it like immobility was the worst possible outcome for a human being, worse than pain, worse than loss, worse than the slow erosion of meaning that happens when you exist without the person who gave your life its shape. I've been thinking, he continued, that maybe you could rent out the second floor. Or the master bedroom. Someone would pay good money for a room with a nice view. It would help with the mortgage. I didn't have a mortgage. I'd paid off the house when Michael died because life insurance was a strange gift that way. It could restore your financial security while simultaneously proving that the universe will take whatever matters most and leave you with cash instead. But I didn't correct him. I just listened as he explained how the room could generate income, how a rental situation could keep me engaged with other people, how it would be better than letting it sit empty like a tomb. That's the word he used.
Tomb.
That's when I started to understand that Franklin wasn't talking about a room anymore. He was talking about who I should be allowed to be after loss. He was talking about the fact that I was failing, in his opinion, to become the kind of person who moves on, who rebuilds, who makes productive use of empty space. He didn't actually care about the room. He cared about making me feel like my grief was an inconvenience. That afternoon, I looked at him sitting on my porch in my house, in my backyard, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite fear, but recognition. Recognition of the fact that some people are drawn to grieving women like sharks detect blood in the water. That some people see loss as an opportunity. That some people view vulnerability as an invitation. That the danger wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was soft. Sometimes it came wearing khakis and saying your name like he'd known you forever. Sometimes it came bearing lasagna and asking about your utility bills. Sometimes it came in the form of someone who was supposed to be your family. The incident happened on a Tuesday in August, 3 months after he'd first mentioned the room. I was at work when he called. He said, "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something important, but I don't want to do it over the phone. Can you come home early?" My stomach dropped. I'd been the recipient of too many "we need to talk" phone calls in the last few years. They were always followed by terrible news. I left work immediately, got into my car, a 2016 Honda CR-V that still smelled faintly of Emma's strawberry shampoo from the car accident we survived together when she was 4, and I was navigating a school zone in Bronxville, and drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white. When I arrived at the house, there were 2 moving trucks in the driveway. Professional movers were carrying out Emma's furniture. The dresser with the scratch. The bed frame. The bookshelf that held all her favorite stories. The ones I'd read to her so many times that I could recite them from memory without looking at a single page. The little wooden desk where she used to draw pictures of princesses and dragons. Everything. I pulled into the driveway and saw Franklin standing in the doorway like he owned the place. Which I was starting to realize he'd been working toward convincing me that he did. "What are you doing?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like my voice. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Sarah, we need to talk about this rationally," Franklin said. He said it like I was being irrational simply by showing up and noticing that my dead daughter's room was being dismantled. "I've been working with your doctor." "My doctor?" "Franklin, what are you talking about?" "And we all agree that holding on to this space is keeping you in a state of arrested development. You're not healing. You need to move forward." "Those are my things." "That's my daughter's room." "Exactly," he said. And then he said something that made my stomach drop even further, made me feel like the ground beneath my feet was becoming less solid. He said the word, temporary. "It's only temporary," he said. "We're putting everything in storage. The baby will be here in 2 months, and the room needs to be prepared. This is what forward looks like, Sarah. This is what healing begins with." I walked past him, into the house, and up to Emma's room. It was already half empty. The walls were bare. The pink paint that she'd chosen when she was 6 years old, a specific shade called Cherry Blossom Dream, looked pale and drained without her furniture in front of it. The carpet had those rectangular marks where her bed had sat for 3.5 years, the floorboard footprints of a life that was over. That her room was being erased. The movers were professional.
They didn't look at me. They didn't speak.
They just continued working, carrying boxes labeled nursery items and wrapping up the dresser with the scratch and plastic like it was a secret that shouldn't be exposed to light. I stood in the doorway, the same doorway where Franklin had stood so many times before, assessing, planning, building towards something, and I realized that I had been stupid. Stupid and trusting and naive. I had let a man inspect my grief like it was a property inspection. I had let him catalog my vulnerability like he was making a list of renovations. I had let him convince me that my love for my dead daughter was an obstacle to my own survival, when in fact, my love for my dead daughter was the only thing keeping me from becoming a person I wouldn't recognize.
"Stop," I said.
My voice was quiet, controlled. I'm not sure the movers even heard me, but Franklin heard me. He turned from where he was standing in the hallway, and he saw something in my face that made him step back. "Get these people out of my house," I said. "Right now." "Sarah, you're not thinking clearly. Out of
my house."
The movers stopped. They looked to Franklin for direction, and Franklin, for the first time since I'd known him, looked uncertain. He looked like a man who'd miscalculated something. He looked like a man who'd assumed that grief had made me fragile, when in reality, grief had made me harder than diamond. It takes a very specific kind of person to move someone's dead daughter's belongings without permission. It takes a particular flavor of entitlement and disrespect and cruelty. It takes someone who has decided that their vision for your future matters more than your agency, your choices, your right to exist in your own house exactly as you need to. The movers left. Franklin stayed for another hour, trying to convince me that I was overreacting, that I was being irrational, that he was only trying to help, that he understood grief better than I did because he'd lost people too, a sister in 1994, his wife to divorce in 2003, and now potentially this relationship with me because I wasn't cooperating with his plan. He kept using words like temporary and helpful and protective. He kept acting like what he'd done was reasonable. Like he'd had my best interests in mind. Like I should be grateful that he was willing to make these decisions for me, since I was apparently incapable of making them myself. I started noticing changes after that day. Locks felt tighter, like someone was testing them when I wasn't home. Mail went missing, not all of it, just certain pieces, just enough to make me wonder. Packages that I'd ordered online would arrive damaged, like they'd been handled with particular force. Franklin started speaking like a landlord. He'd mention property values. He'd talk about building equity and long-term investments and ensuring that your assets are protected. He suggested adding his name to my deed for protection, in case something happened to me, in case I became incapacitated, in case I needed someone to manage my affairs. He mentioned something called estate planning, which is a normal thing that people do, but the way he said it made it sound like an opportunity rather than a precaution. That's when I started investigating. I went to the county clerk's office in White Plains and requested copies of my deed. I met with a lawyer, not my therapist, not a friend, but an actual lawyer named Patricia Chun who practiced family and property law out of an office in New Rochelle, just down from the Metro North station. Patricia looked at my deed and looked at me and said, "Have you considered that this might escalate?" "Escalate how?" I asked. "Has he made any statements about your mental health? Your fitness as a homeowner? Anything that could be documented?" And that's when I realized that I'd been tracking the wrong crime. Franklin wasn't trying to steal my house. He was building a case against my sanity. He was collecting evidence. He was documenting every instance where my grief was visible, every time I mentioned missing Emma, every moment where I failed to perform the kind of happiness that made other people comfortable. He was preparing legal ammunition. Patricia helped me understand guardianship law, which is a legal mechanism that allows a person to be declared unfit to manage their own affairs, their money, their property, their choices, and have all those decisions transferred to someone else. It's used for elderly people with dementia. It's used for people with severe mental illness. It's supposed to protect vulnerable people. But it can also be weaponized. It can be used to take everything from someone, to erase their autonomy, to render them a shell of a person living in a world where someone else has decided what they're allowed to do. Franklin was working toward getting me declared unfit. Not through violence or force, but through the legal system. Through the system designed to protect people like me. Patricia said, "You need to document everything. You need to keep a record of every interaction. You need to understand that if he files for guardianship, the burden of proof will be on you to prove that you're capable of managing your own life." So, I started writing things down. I kept a journal. I recorded phone calls, which is legal in New York if one party to the conversation is consenting, and I was obviously consenting to recording my own voice, and I documented every visit, every comment, every veiled threat or thinly disguised insult. I went back to my therapist in New Canaan, Dr. Marie Caldwell, who specializes in grief and trauma, and I asked her to write a letter stating that I was mentally competent, that my grief was normal and appropriate for someone who'd lost a child, that I was not a danger to myself or others. She wrote a very strong letter. It helped. A week after that, Franklin called and asked if he could come over on Sunday for a family meeting. He said he'd been talking to his lawyer. The fact that he'd hired a lawyer sent ice through my veins, and they thought it was important to discuss the situation as a family. He said Michael's half-brother would be there, and his ex-wife, and maybe a social worker, just to make sure everything was fair and transparent. A social worker. In my house. On a Sunday. That's when I understood that this was no longer a situation I could handle by myself. That was the moment I realized I needed to be prepared for war. Sunday came exactly the way Sundays always come, slowly, and then all at once. I woke up that morning with a feeling in my chest like something was breaking, and I lay in bed for an hour just breathing and trying to convince myself that I was strong enough for whatever was coming. I took a shower using a shampoo that smelled like lavender and chamomile, the kind with essential oils and promises about stress relief. I put on clothes that made me look capable and sane. Dark slacks, a white blouse, the kind of outfit that a competent adult woman would wear to a meeting where her sanity was being evaluated. I made coffee. I drank it. I didn't taste it. At noon, they started arriving. Franklin came first, which surprised me. He came early the way he always did, and he looked around my house like he was trying to memorize its layout, like he was planning something. His lawyer came next, a thin man named Derek with a face like a knife and a briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment would be if I had one. Then Michael's half-brother Thomas arrived, and his ex-wife Danielle, and finally, a woman named Patricia Rodriguez, not my lawyer Patricia Chin, a different Patricia, who said she was there as a neutral third party to ensure fairness. We sat around my dining room table. My good table, the one Michael and I had bought together at a furniture store in New Canaan before Emma was born, back when we thought our lives were going to be simple and uncomplicated. The coffee cups sat in front of us, untouched. The silence was louder than any words could be. Franklin spoke first. He said, "Sarah, we care about you very much. That's why we're here."
He said it softly.
He said it like he'd practiced. He used words like care, safety, and the baby, as if those words were magical incantations that would make me believe his intentions were pure. "Over the past 6 months, we've noticed some concerning patterns in your behavior," he continued. "The way you've maintained your daughter's room, for instance. The way you've focused exclusively on your loss without making attempts to rebuild your life. The way you've resisted help from family members who are trying to support you." He gestured to Derek, who opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. My heart was doing something in my chest that didn't feel entirely healthy. "We've consulted with a physician," Derek said, his voice smooth like oil, "and we believe that guardianship would be in your best interest. It would ensure that your assets are protected, that your home is managed responsibly, and that major decisions are made in consultation with people who have your well-being at heart. The words were sliding around me like water, trying to find a way in.
Guardianship.
Unfit. Assets. Managed. All the words designed to make me feel small and incapable. All the words designed to convince me that I was broken. Thomas said something about the baby. Danielle said something about moving forward. Patricia Rodriguez said something about best practices in grief management. And all the while, Franklin sat at the head of my table in my house and waited to see if I would crumble. That's when I realized something crucial. Franklin was waiting for me to react. He was waiting for me to cry, to shout, to fall apart, to give him evidence that I was unstable. He was waiting for me to prove that everything he'd been saying was true. But what Franklin didn't know was that I'd stopped reacting. I'd stopped defending. I'd stopped playing the role of the grieving widow that he'd cast me in. I'd spent the last 6 weeks preparing. I'd talked to my lawyer. I'd talked to my therapist. I'd documented everything. And I'd made copies. Many copies. I pulled a folder out of the drawer next to me and I slid it across the table. The sound it made, that papery whisper, was the loudest sound anyone had made all afternoon. Derek opened it. His face changed. Inside was my therapist's letter. Inside were copies of my deed. Inside was a signed affidavit from Patricia Chin outlining Franklin's behavior and the dates and times when each incident had occurred. Inside were phone records. Inside were emails. Inside was a comprehensive documentation of 6 months of manipulation, boundary crossing, and preparation for a guardianship case that had no legal merit. Inside was evidence that Franklin had been acting without my consent, that he'd called my doctor, a HIPAA violation, and that he'd been building a case based on selective facts and distorted interpretations of normal grief. Derek's face turned a color that I can only describe as the color of someone who had just realized they were about to be on the losing side of a lawsuit. Franklin stopped looking at my house. He started looking at the clock. For the first time, I had power in that room. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted, and it was no longer me defending myself against a man who thought I was fragile. It was a man who'd made the mistake of underestimating a woman he thought grief had broken, when in fact, grief had made me harder than diamond, sharper than steel, smarter than he could ever be. Patricia Rodriguez cleared her throat. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Danielle was checking her phone. Derek was shuffling papers back into his briefcase. And Franklin, my father-in-law, the man who'd raised my husband, the man who'd called himself family, the man who'd decided that my grief was an inconvenience and my house was an opportunity, stood up very slowly and walked to the door. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge what had just happened. He just left. The house was quiet after that. So quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat, that strange metronome of survival, that proof that I was still alive in a way that mattered. Grief makes people underestimate you. Especially women. Especially quiet ones. Especially women whose loss has made them invisible in other people's eyes. Women whose pain makes everyone around them uncomfortable. Women whose suffering gives permission to others to make decisions about their lives as if they have that right. But grief also teaches you how to survive people who think they can wait you out. Grief teaches you that you are stronger than your loss, that you can endure things that feel impossible, that you can move through pain, and emerge on the other side as someone fundamentally different. Someone harder. Someone smarter. Someone who understands the ways that people try to take what doesn't belong to them and is willing to fight back. What would you have done in my place? Because what Franklin did next wasn't over. What happened after that Sunday meeting wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something darker. It was the moment when desperation made him less careful. It was the moment when he decided that if he couldn't take my house through legality, he would try something else entirely. Because what Franklin did next happened in court. What Franklin did next was a lawsuit that would take everything from him. What Franklin did next was a decision that would cost him his law license, his relationship with his son, and his reputation in every social circle that mattered to him. And I was the one who made that happen. Not by being quiet. Not by being weak. Not by being a woman alone and grieving in a house that a man had decided was his to manage, but by being precisely the kind of person he'd underestimated. By being exactly what survival looks like when it decides to stop cooperating with anyone else's narrative. Like this video and subscribe. I'll tell you how far he really went. I'll tell you how close he came to winning. And I'll tell you what happened when a grieving woman decided that her story belonged to her and no one else.